It is truly fascinating how history can pivot on a dime. Just a few weeks ago, the world was holding its collective breath, staring down the barrel of a massive, uncontrollable escalation in the Middle East. The Strait of Hormuz was effectively paralyzed. Global energy markets were in absolute freefall, and the drumbeat of a full-scale U.S.-Iran war was deafening.
It felt inevitable, didn't it? Like watching a train derail in slow motion. Everyone was bracing for the impact, calculating just how high gas prices would spike and how far the geopolitical fallout would spread. But then, right at the precipice, somebody hit the pause button.
Exactly. On April 7th, we get this sudden, almost surreal announcement of a 2-week mutual ceasefire. And the wildest part of this entire scenario isn't just the pause itself. It's the architect behind it. We aren't talking about Geneva, or Oslo, or even Beijing stepping in to mediate. The diplomatic lifeline came directly from Islamabad.
Which is a plot twist very few analysts saw coming. Pakistan has suddenly emerged as the indispensable geopolitical shock absorber. To go from a quiet, behind-the-scenes facilitator to the central broker of a ceasefire between Washington and Tehran is a monumental leap. It completely redefines what a middle power can achieve in a multipolar world. They didn't just pass messages. They essentially drafted the blueprint that both sides eventually agreed to.
I want to dig into that blueprint, because the mechanics of how this actually happened are incredible. We are looking at a situation where direct talks between the US and Iran were completely stalled. The lines were dead. And into that void steps Pakistan's leadership, specifically Prime Minister Shehbaz Sharif and Army Chief Field Marshal Asim Munir. They essentially turned Islamabad into the ultimate back channel.
They did, and it required a very delicate high-wire balancing act. You have the civilian leadership and the military establishment working in perfect tandem. Prime Minister Sharif is working the diplomatic phones, publicly urging an extension on deadlines and proposing this ingenious two-phased truce plan. Meanwhile, you have Field Marshal Munir utilizing deep-rooted military-to-military ties. This wasn't just polite diplomatic chatter. They were actively relaying a US 5-point ceasefire framework, blending it with their own proposals, and selling it to Tehran.
And the payoff was incredibly public. You have the US president explicitly crediting these conversations with Sharif and Munir on Truth Social, of all places. He literally cited their input as the foundation for this double-sided ceasefire. It's a very modern, slightly surreal flavor of diplomacy, when a major global conflict is paused via a social media post thanking Pakistan. But it begs the question, why them? Out of all the countries that could have stepped up, why did Pakistan have the specific gravity required to pull this off?
It comes down to a perfect storm of geography, necessity, and a very unique brand of neutrality. Think about Pakistan's position on the board. They share a massive, historically complex border with Iran. At the same time, despite plenty of historical friction, their military maintains very robust, institutional ties with the United States. Add to that their deep economic reliance on Gulf states and their strategic partnership with China through the Economic Corridor. Pakistan is the only player in the room who can look Washington, Tehran, Beijing, and Riyadh in the eye and be taken seriously by all of them. They aren't fully in anyone's pocket, which makes them a credible messenger.
But there's also a powerful element of self-preservation here, isn't there? This isn't just altruistic peacemaking. If the Strait of Hormuz remains closed, Pakistan's economy, which is already navigating incredibly choppy waters, takes a direct, devastating hit. They import a massive amount of their oil through that exact route.
Oh, absolutely. You don't volunteer to put out a fire in your neighbor's house just to be a good neighbor. You do it because your own roof is made of dry thatch and the wind is blowing your way. Reopening that waterway is an existential economic necessity for Pakistan. That desperate need for stability actually enhanced their credibility as a mediator. Both the US and Iran knew Pakistan wasn't playing some abstract game of three-dimensional chess. Islamabad needed the oil to flow, which made their push for a ceasefire entirely pragmatic and trustworthy.
That pragmatism seems to have resonated regionally too. Before this ceasefire was even announced, Pakistan hosted a four-nation summit in late March with Saudi Arabia, Turkey, and Egypt. That's a heavy-hitting lineup. It feels like Islamabad wasn't just acting alone. They were actively building a multilateral coalition to force a de-escalation.
That was perhaps their most brilliant tactical move. By bringing in Riyadh, Ankara, and Cairo, Pakistan essentially built a diplomatic wall around the conflict. They created a unified Sunni and regional bloc that said, "Enough, we cannot afford this war." And let's not forget China standing in the background, publicly backing Pakistan's initiative. When you have that kind of multilateral weight behind your proposals, it becomes very difficult for either Washington or Tehran to simply walk away from the table.
Which brings us to the table itself. This Friday, the stakes get infinitely higher. We are moving from back-channel whispers and temporary pauses to direct, face-to-face negotiations hosted in Islamabad. The goal is to convert this fragile two-week window into a durable agreement, possibly using Iran's 10-point peace proposal as a starting line. But the trust deficit here is monumental. Can a middle power actually force two deeply entrenched adversaries to compromise on core issues like denuclearization or proxy warfare?
That is the million-dollar question. And frankly, it is where the limits of middle power diplomacy are brutally exposed. Pakistan can set the table, they can provide the room, and they can even write the menu. But they cannot force the US and Iran to eat. They simply do not have the coercive leverage, the economic sanctions, or the overwhelming military threat to enforce compliance. If Tehran digs its heels in over unacceptable demands, or if Washington refuses to budge on sanctions relief, Pakistan's leverage evaporates.
It's a massive gamble for Islamabad. If these talks collapse on Friday, or if the ceasefire shatters in a few weeks, Pakistan is left holding the bag. They face incredible domestic pressures, complex dynamics with India and Afghanistan, and a heavy reliance on Gulf donors. Overplaying their hand could severely strain those ties. It makes you wonder about the hidden costs of playing the peacemaker.
It is an immense risk. If you step into the arena of great power conflict and fail, you don't just lose face. You potentially alienate the very superpowers you rely on for your own security and economic survival. But let's look at the philosophical shift this represents. For decades, the assumption was that only a superpower could untangle a geopolitical crisis of this magnitude. What this moment reveals is a profound fragmentation of global power. Superpowers are increasingly constrained by their own domestic politics and historical baggage. They are trapped in their own narratives.
So they actually need these middle powers to provide an off-ramp. They need a country like Pakistan to offer a face-saving exit that they couldn't possibly propose themselves without looking weak to their own domestic audiences.
Precisely. Pakistan offered a mirror where both Trump and the Iranian leadership could look at a compromise and call it a victory. That is the true art of modern diplomacy. It's less about imposing your will and more about constructing a narrative where everyone gets to walk away feeling like they won.
It really makes you rethink the architecture of global security. We are entering an era where regional stability might not be dictated by Washington or Beijing, but carefully stitched together by capitals like Islamabad, acting out of sheer necessity.
And whether that stitching holds will be determined in the next 48 to 72 hours. If this Islamabad Accord actually materializes into long-term peace, it will be studied in diplomatic academies for a century. It would be a defining victory for middle power influence. But if it falls apart, it will serve as a stark, tragic reminder of just how fragile our multipolar world really is.
The tension is palpable. We are quite literally watching the endgame of a potential war being negotiated in real time. The framework is there, the hosts are ready, but the underlying animosity hasn't magically disappeared. It's a reminder that pausing a conflict is merely the prologue. The actual work of peace is infinitely harder.
It is. The music has stopped for now, but everyone in that room in Islamabad this Friday knows the silence is incredibly fragile. One wrong word, one miscalculated demand, and the entire region could be plunged right back into the dark.
We will be watching those closed doors in Islamabad very, very closely. The fate of the global economy and millions of lives might just hinge on what happens in that room over the weekend. It's a profound moment in modern history, and the clock is officially ticking.